The moment he stepped deeper into the path, the air around him seemed to thicken, like it was absorbing his every movement, weighing him down with a quiet intensity, and the space that stretched before him was no longer neutral, no longer passive in its observation, but actively shaping itself in response to his presence, the walls around him materializing as if responding to the choices he had made. And for the first time, he felt like he was not just part of the environment, but that his decisions were carving it out, pulling fragments from his own mind and putting them in place, constructing the world around him like an unfinished puzzle. And every step felt deliberate, like it wasn't just about moving forward anymore, but about sculpting this reality, and each moment, no matter how small, carried an almost oppressive weight because now there was no escaping it, no way to look away from the truth of it all, the truth of who he was and what he had done. The further he walked, the more the path seemed to take on a life of its own, no longer linear or structured, but a maze of rooms and corridors, each one filled with echoes of himself, distorted in ways that felt both familiar and wrong, faces and voices he had forgotten. Fragments of conversations that never really finished, and every turn he made only led him deeper into the heart of the puzzle, further into the maze of his own making. There was no sense of time here, no way to mark how long he had been walking, no reason to believe the space would ever end, because it was as if he had entered a loop, a never-ending cycle of his own reflection, and each time he thought he had reached a dead end, another version of him appeared, another face, another voice, reminding him of something he had hidden or forgotten. And then, amidst this chaos of self-reflection, there was a shift subtle at first, but impossible to ignore. As if the maze itself was beginning to recognize him, as if it was no longer just a place he wandered through, but a place that was studying him, evaluating him, watching his every move with quiet anticipation, and for the first time since he entered this distorted reality, he felt a tremor of uncertainty ripple through him, as if the ground beneath him wasn't just a surface, but something alive, something that could react to him, and when he glanced around, the path that had once been confusing and endless now seemed to narrow to focus, like it was guiding him towards something, and the walls themselves seemed to pulse like they were breathing with him, in time with his own heartbeat. And for a moment, he wondered if this was the point where everything would finally make sense, where the choices he had been making would lead him to some kind of answer, some kind of resolution. But as he moved forward, the air grew colder, the walls more oppressive, and the faces he encountered became less familiar, more unfamiliar. Like the reflections of himself that were meant to guide him had started to distort, turning into something darker, something more sinister. The smiles, once welcoming, were now twisted, the voices that had once offered wisdom now whispered threats, and he realized, with a growing sense of dread, that the maze he had been wandering through had never been about finding answers. It was about facing the things he had been running from. And the further he went, the more those things were coming after him. The space itself seemed to shift again, no longer a passive backdrop, but an active participant, a force trying to trap him within its labyrinth. And with each step, the walls seemed to close in tighter, the space shrinking, the echoes of his past growing louder, until they were deafening, until he could no longer distinguish between the maze and his own thoughts, and for the first time in this twisted journey, he felt real fear of the place he had created, fear of the things he had buried, and fear of what would happen if he couldn't escape it. But escape, as he was starting to realize, was no longer an option. Not physically, not mentally, not in any way that mattered. The more he tried to run, the more he was forced to confront the truth that had been building inside of him. The realization that this maze wasn't just a test of endurance, but a test of his willingness to face himself, to confront the parts of him he had been avoiding. And as the walls closed in, as the echoes grew louder, he finally stopped trying to push against it, stopped trying to outrun the truth. And for the first time since he began this journey, he allowed himself to stand still, to listen to the voices that were calling out from all around him, because deep down, he knew they weren't trying to hurt him, they were trying to help him see what he had been avoiding. And in that moment, when the silence finally fell, the maze stopped shifting, the walls settled, the whispers faded, and what remained was not the reflection of his fears, but a quiet understanding. He wasn't trapped. He was learning. And that knowledge, more than anything else, was the key to finding his way out. As the silence hung in the air, the pressure that had once felt suffocating now shifted to a strange calm. The maze, once overwhelming and alive with chaos, had stilled itself, no longer a living entity to be feared, but a mirror that reflected every part of him, his choices, his regrets, his fears, and his moments of growth. And for the first time, he realized that the path forward wasn't one that would be carved out by trying to escape or run from these reflections. It was about accepting them, about letting them coexist without the constant need to fight, deny, or bury them. The space before him no longer felt like a maze, but a landscape. It was still fragmented, still incomplete, but it was no longer hostile, no longer pushing him to prove something to himself. Each corner of the space felt like an invitation to explore, to understand, rather than to conquer. The walls that once pressed in on him had softened, becoming more like landmarks in a place he had been trying to avoid for too long. They weren't walls anymore, just parts of the landscape he had created, now standing still, waiting for him to move. He took a step forward, this time without hesitation. The ground beneath him was firm, but not rigid. It felt like it was reacting to him, as if it recognized the shift inside of him. It wasn't demanding anything from him, it was simply giving him the freedom to choose. And for the first time in a long time, that choice didn't feel overwhelming. It felt liberating. As he moved further, the space around him continued to change, but now it was subtle, like the world was gently revealing its next layer. A room appeared before him, quiet, simple, and unassuming. A stark contrast to the complex and chaotic environment he had just walked through. There were no mirrors, no echoes, no versions of himself lurking in the shadows. Just a small, humble room with a window that opened to the outside, a sliver of sky visible through the frame. He walked to the window, gazing out into the expanse that stretched beyond it. The world outside was vast, uncharted, yet welcoming, and as he stood there, something clicked inside him. This was the moment. The moment where he wasn't trapped, where the world outside wasn't something to fear, but something to embrace. The window wasn't a barrier anymore, it was a portal, a view into everything that lay ahead, not because it was clear, but because it was open. He turned away from the window, no longer looking for answers or closure, but for understanding. The room he stood in was empty, but in its simplicity, it felt full of possibilities. The walls no longer felt like they were closing in, they felt like a foundation. A foundation for everything that could come next. He realized that the maze wasn't the destination, it was the journey. It had brought him to this point of clarity, this understanding that he had been seeking. The versions of himself, once scattered throughout the space, had faded, not because they were gone, but because they had merged with him. They were no longer separate entities in his mind. They were parts of him that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting to be understood. And now, standing in the simplicity of this room, he understood that they were all him, every version, every choice, every moment. And together, they had brought him to this place. The space around him began to change again, but this time, it wasn't shifting in the way it had before. The fragments no longer seemed threatening. They weren't fragments anymore. They were pieces of a whole. He was the whole. And as the room expanded around him, the horizon grew, the sky stretching wider, the path clearer, not because it had been laid out before him, but because he had finally stopped trying to force it into something it was never meant to be. And when he stepped outside, there was no grand revelation, no explosion of light or sound, just the steady, quiet certainty that this was what came next. A world where the maze didn't need to be escaped, where the choices he made didn't have to be perfect, where the future was still uncertain, but full of potential. He wasn't trapped in the maze anymore. He was free, and that freedom was not defined by where he was or what he had done, but by how he moved forward, step by step. knowing that everything he needed to continue was already within him. The path was no longer something to be feared or avoided, it was something to be walked. And in that simplicity, in that understanding, he realized he had already begun.